the sharp tip of a rusted spear pressed against Julia's collarbone. She backed into the damp stone, her hands trembling as the stolen bowl of stew rattled on its wooden tray. Above her, the guard raised his torch with a cruel sneer. Far below them, swallowed by the freezing abyss, the chained Alpha King heard the threat. The realm called him a monster who reduced cities to ash. He had endured a decade of darkness and silent apathy, but the sound of steel drawn against the only girl who fed him severed his restraint. White frost coated the iron bars of his cage. The air in the narrow stairwell grew dangerously thick as a low, unnatural rumble vibrated through the bedrock. But their secret bond in the shadows began with a much quieter defiance. The edict carved into the black stone of the fortress wall promised death. Anyone caught wandering past the third sublevel of the dungeons would face the headsman before dawn. It was a law born of pure terror. The kingdom knew the prisoner locked in the deepest abyss merely as a force of devastation. Soldiers huddled around tavern fires and exchanged hushed stories of his past campaigns. They claimed his mere presence could wither courage and turn seasoned warriors into cowards. He was a man who had allegedly burned 3 rival cities to ash in a single night. Rumors painted him as a beast lacking human empathy. Only the cruelest wardens drew lots to feed him. Their duty was simple and terrifying. They would carry raw meat down the spiral stairs and hurl the cuts through a rusted hatch. Those guards never lingered to check if the prisoner ate. They never spoke of what they felt in that freezing darkness. Flinging the rations, they sprinted back up the steps as if death chased them. Fear hung heavy over the entire keep because of the man buried alive below their feet. Julia was the lowest scullery maid in a kitchen dominated by harsh voices. She spent her waking hours scrubbing iron pots until her knuckles cracked. No one in the bustling fortress noticed the quiet girl who kept her gaze fixed on the floorboards. Her existence was defined by ash and strict obedience. Yet she harbored a quiet defiance that no overseer ever recognized. Tonight, the great hearth fire had finally died down to glowing embers. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen were bolted shut for the night. Julia stood alone in the dim light of a tallow candle. She carefully wrapped a stolen loaf of bread in a clean cloth. Her hands moved with practiced silence as she added a bowl of warm stew to her wooden tray. She knew it was madness to risk her life for a condemned man. The horrific tales about the captive were whispered in every corner of the servant quarters. But hunger was a lingering cruelty she understood deeply. She could not bear the thought of a living soul starving in the damp earth. The descent into the cellar was a journey away from the living. Torchlight soon gave way to thick shadows. Julia kept her free hand pressed against the damp wall to steady her balance. The air grew sharper with every downward step. It bit fiercely at her thin shawl. Each revolution of the spiral staircase felt like sinking deeper into a grave. Forcing her trembling legs forward required immense effort. Her worn shoes made almost no sound on the ancient granite. The silence in the deep earth pressed heavily against her ears. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy stillness of a predator holding its breath. She finally reached the bottom landing. A massive iron door stood at the end of the narrow corridor. Thick chains bound the heavy bars together. The metal bars were covered in a layer of white frost. He was in there. Julia stopped a few paces away from the imposing cell. Her breath clouded rapidly in the freezing air. A crushing weight pressed down on her chest. It was an aura of suppressed power. It radiated outward from the pitch-black void beyond the bars. A lesser person would have dropped the tray and fled up the stairs. Julia swallowed hard to clear the nervous lump in her throat. Kneeling slowly on the unforgiving stone floor, she lowered her eyes. The tray made a soft scraping sound as she set it down. She slid the wooden bowl closer to the narrow gap beneath the bars. Pushing the wrapped bread right beside it felt like crossing a dangerous threshold. "I brought you something warm," she whispered into the darkness. A slight tremor lived in her voice despite her best efforts to control it. The sound felt too frail to survive in this cavernous prison. Nothing moved in the suffocating shadows. The silence stretched out until her heart pounded in her ears. Then came the sudden sound of chains shifting. It was a slow metallic scrape that sent a shiver down her spine. A towering shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom of the cell. Arthur stepped into the faint slice of pale moonlight bleeding from a high grate. He did not look like the rabid beast the bards sang about. His guards only shouted vile curses. Looking down, he watched the steam rising from the hunter stew. His mind instantly categorized it as a trick. It had to be laced with poison, or designed as some new psychological torture. He shifted his piercing gaze back to the woman's face. Julia did not flinch away from his overwhelming scrutiny. She kept her hands resting visibly on her lap. Her heart hammered frantically against her ribs. She forced herself to meet his eyes. They were hollow. They held the bone-deep exhaustion of 100 wars. "It is only root vegetables and broth," she said softly. She pushed the bowl a fraction of an inch further under the bars. "You must eat to keep the cold away." Arthur did not trust the inviting warmth radiating from the meal. He trusted the hidden motives of mortals even less. Yet there was a strange lack of deceit in the woman's open posture. She smelled faintly of hearth smoke. There was no metallic tang of sweat clinging to her skin. He took a slow step forward. The heavy links dragged loudly against the stone floor. Julia held her breath as the formidable man knelt on his side of the bars. He moved with a lethal grace that betrayed his captive state. His large hand reached slowly toward the steaming bowl. Thick calluses covered his knuckles. His long fingers brushed briefly against the rough wood. He did not pull the food back into the shadows immediately. Instead, he looked up at her face once more. This time, his intense scrutiny was devoid of killing intent. It was an unspoken question. Why would a fragile maid risk the executioner for him? Julia offered a hesitant smile in return. It was a simple gesture that cost her nothing, but meant everything in this bleak cellar. "I will leave it here," she murmured quietly. Standing up, she smoothed the wrinkles from her coarse apron. The bitter chill of the dungeon had already begun to seep into her bones. She needed to return to her cot before the cooks noticed her absence. Arthur watched her rise to her feet. He remained silent. His throat was dry and unused to the act of speech. He simply pulled the bowl and the bread through the narrow gap. The heat of the ceramic felt like a miracle against his numb palms. Julia picked up her empty tray. She turned and began the arduous ascent back to the surface. Forcing her eyes forward, she refused to look over her shoulder. If she had turned around, she would have witnessed something the realm deemed impossible. The warlord was eating the humble meal slowly. He savored the meager broth with a quiet reverence. His dark eyes never left the patch of stone where she had knelt. The crushing isolation that had walled his mind for a decade had suddenly cracked. A single thread of light had pierced his suffocating darkness. She had expected to find a beast foaming with rage. Bracing for grasping claws had been her only defense. Instead, a captive bore his punishment in stoic silence. There was a tragic dignity in the way he held the wooden spoon. His quiet endurance made her own daily struggles seem trivial. Pausing on the third step from the bottom, she hesitated. A strange urge to speak to him washed over her mind. She wanted to ask him for his true name. She wanted to know if the horrific legends held any truth. Survival instincts forced her to keep moving upward. Tomorrow would bring another long day of toil. She wondered if she could manage to save another portion of food. The dangerous thought bloomed in her mind without permission. She had already committed high treason by coming down here once. Planning to return the next night was an act of madness. Yet she knew she would walk these steps again. Arthur tracked the faint rhythm of her ascending footsteps. He listened intently until the soft sounds faded into silence. The heavy door at the top of the stairwell groaned shut in the distance. The cellar immediately returned to its oppressive gloom. But the frozen air felt inexplicably different now. It carried the comforting scent of baked bread. He finished the last drop of the stew. Setting the empty bowl down required meticulous care. His broad back found purchase against the freezing stone wall. For the first time in a decade, the winter cold did not bite into his soul. The violent fury that constantly boiled in his veins had settled into a steady hum. Closing his eyes, he leaned his head back. He vividly recalled the slight tremor in her voice. Memorizing the gentle curve of her smile became his only focus. The arrogant lords of the realm thought they had buried him alive. They firmly believed he would rot in this cage until time erased his memory. They were wrong. He was a man who had commanded vast armies. He had endured physical tortures that would break 100 lesser men. But nothing had ever disarmed him like the slide of a wooden bowl across a stone floor. He reached out and touched the spot on the ground just outside the bars. The rough stone was still faintly warm from her knees. A quiet vow took root in his mind. He did not know the brave girl's name. He did not know why she had chosen mercy over fear. But he knew he would survive to see the sun set again. He would listen in the dark for the whisper of her shoes on the granite steps. The monster in the dark had finally found a reason to endure the long night. He waited for her return like a child waits for the morning. Time moved differently in the lower depths of the fortress. For Arthur, the passing days were no longer measured by the shifting shadows on the stone ceiling. They were calculated by the agonizing wait for a specific sound. He spent his waking hours sitting motionless against the damp wall. His keen senses strained constantly to catch the slightest vibration from the spiral staircase. The formidable warlord had once dictated the fate of empires with a single word. Now he found his entire existence anchored to the fragile rhythm of a servant's nightly descent. Every evening brought a fresh wave of quiet torment. He would imagine the heavy wooden door opening at the top of the steps. Doubt often whispered through his mind during the longest hours of the afternoon. Perhaps she had been caught by the cruel overseers. Perhaps the sheer terror of his presence had finally deterred her from returning. He had spent a decade convinced that humanity was a hollow illusion. Yet this nameless girl had shattered that belief with a single bowl of stew. The memory of her trembling hands occupied his every thought. He replayed the image of her kneeling on the unforgiving granite over and over. Her bravery was a silent rebellion against the brutal laws of the keep. When the faint scrape of her worn shoes finally echoed down the corridor, his chest would tighten. The chained captive would slowly rise from his corner before she even reached the landing. He wanted to spare her the fear of a sudden movement in the dark. Standing tall behind the rusted bars, he waited with a quiet reverence. He was no longer a caged beast enduring the cold. He was a man awaiting the sunrise. Julia lived a dual life in the bustling world above. Sunlight brought only exhaustion and relentless commands. The head cook possessed a harsh temper and a heavy wooden spoon. She demanded flawless obedience from every maid in the crowded kitchen. Julia scrubbed massive cauldrons until her fingers bled into the soapy water. Her back ached with a dull fire that never truly faded. Keeping her eyes downcast was her primary defense mechanism. No one looked twice at the quiet girl who faded into the background smoke. They saw only a docile worker incapable of deceit. Beneath her coarse apron, however, a dangerous secret burned against her ribs. Stealing food from the Lord's larder was an offense punishable by hanging. Every stolen morsel was a calculated risk that shortened her breath. She learned to slide half a loaf of bread into her pocket when the cooks argued. She memorized the exact moments when the pantry guard turned his back to cough. Saving her own meager rations became a daily sacrifice. Her stomach often twisted with hunger pangs during the long afternoon shifts. But the physical pain felt insignificant compared to the purpose driving her. She knew a living man was freezing in the abyss below. She could not leave him to the mercy of the void. Their nightly encounters had evolved into a silent ritual. Words were rarely exchanged in the cavernous chill of the dungeon. The oppressive silence of the cell block was too profound for trivial conversation. Julia would kneel on the familiar patch of stone. Her hands moved with practiced care as she slid the wooden tray under the heavy gate. Arthur would kneel opposite her. The thick iron bars separated their physical forms. They could not separate the intense connection sparking between them. He always took the food with a startling gentleness. His large hands were scarred from countless unseen battles. Yet they moved with a deliberate slowness to avoid startling her. Their fingertips never touched, but the proximity sent a strange warmth up her arms. Julia found herself lingering longer with each passing night. The initial terror that had gripped her heart was entirely gone. She began to notice the striking details of his worn face. A harsh scar cut cleanly across his strong jawline. His dark hair fell in untamed waves over his forehead. Despite the grime of the dungeon, an undeniable nobility clung to him. He ate the meager offerings, as if attending a royal banquet. Arthur noticed every subtle change in her demeanor as well. He saw the dark circles blooming beneath her kind eyes. He registered the fresh burns on her wrist from the kitchen hearth. A dangerous possessiveness began to stir within his chest. He hated the invisible masters who drove her to such exhaustion. He wanted to shatter the iron chains and shield her from the grueling world above. Such protective instincts were foreign to a man raised for conquest. He had only known how to destroy enemies and conquer lands. Now, he only wanted to preserve the delicate smile she offered him in the gloom. One evening, Julia brought a stolen apple hidden in her skirts. She rolled the red fruit across the stone with a soft, nervous laugh. Arthur caught it before it could strike the back wall. He held the vibrant fruit in his palm like a sacred relic. The color seemed impossibly bright in the monochrome despair of his prison. He looked up, pinning her with a gaze so intense it stole her breath. "You should not risk so much for me," he whispered. His voice was a deep rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. It was rough from disuse, but carried a commanding weight. Julia felt a sudden flutter in her pulse. She pulled her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. "A king should not starve in the dark," she replied softly. The forbidden title slipped from her lips before she could stop it. She had heard the tavern whispers about his true identity. She knew she was feeding the Alpha King who had once terrorized the continent. Arthur froze at the sound of the word. His eyes darkened with a complex storm of memories. He expected her to recoil now that the truth was spoken aloud. He waited for the inevitable disgust to twist her gentle features. Julia simply tilted her head and met his gaze without flinching. She saw no monster behind the frosted iron. She saw only a man who treated her with more respect than any free citizen ever had. "Tomorrow I will try to bring extra cheese," she promised quietly. Rising to her feet, she cast one last lingering look at his shadowed form. Arthur watched her disappear into the stairwell. The word king echoed in the hollow chamber long after she vanished. He closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the icy bars. If he was still a king, she was his only remaining subject. He would burn the world down again before letting anyone harm her. The fragile peace of their routine was destined to shatter. Winter was tightening its grip on the fortress. Provisions in the main storehouse were naturally dwindling. The lord of the castle was a paranoid man, obsessed with his wealth. He ordered a sudden and strict audit of all kitchen supplies. The atmosphere in the scullery shifted from harsh to lethal. Guards with sharp spears were posted near the pantry doors. The head cook began weighing the flour sacks twice a day. Whispers of a thief in the servant quarters spread like a plague. Julia felt an invisible noose tightening around her neck. Stealing even a crust of bread required immense cunning. She went 2 entire days without eating her own meals. She saved her exact portions by wrapping them in oily rags beneath her mattress. Her hands shook from weakness as she scrubbed the evening pots. The risk of descending into the cellar had multiplied tenfold. The guards were ordered to patrol the upper corridors with increased frequency. Every creaking floorboard sounded like a death sentence. Tonight, the tension in the kitchen had reached a breaking point. The head overseer had just publicly flogged a stable boy for stealing an egg. The metallic crack of the whip still echoed in Julia's mind. She waited until the final candle was snuffed out in the servants' hall. The stone floors were agonizingly cold against her thin shoes. She held her breath as she slipped past the sleeping guards in the lower bailey. The wooden tray felt heavier than usual in her trembling grip. She carried a thick slice of roasted mutton concealed beneath a linen cloth. It was a prize that could easily cost her her life. She reached the heavy oak door leading to the dungeon stairs. The iron ring was freezing beneath her touch. She pulled it open with agonizing slowness to prevent the hinges from groaning. Slipping into the pitch-black stairwell, she finally exhaled a shaky breath. She began the long descent into the suffocating darkness. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She focused only on the thought of Arthur waiting for her at the bottom. But the shadows tonight felt different. The silence was not empty. Halfway down the spiral, a sudden sound froze the blood in her veins. It was the distinct scrape of a leather boot on stone. It came from the landing directly above her. Someone had followed her into the dark. A torch suddenly flared to life behind her. The harsh yellow light threw her elongated shadow down the remaining stairs. "Stop right there, thief," a cruel voice echoed through the stairwell. Julia stood paralyzed on the narrow steps. The wooden tray rattled uncontrollably in her hands. She was trapped between the armed guard above and the locked monster below. The harsh light of the blazing torch blinded Julia instantly. She squeezed her eyes shut against the sudden yellow glare. A heavy leather boot struck the stone step just above her head. The metallic rattle of a chainmail chute echoed loudly down the spiral shaft. "I knew a rat was scurrying through the dark," a cruel voice sneered. Julia pressed her spine hard against the curved wall of the stairwell. The wooden tray trembled violently in her rigid hands. She tried to hide the stolen mutton beneath her coarse apron. It was a futile gesture under the revealing torchlight. The patrol guard lowered the iron tip of his rusted spear. He aimed the lethal weapon directly at her throat. "The Lord hangs thieves at dawn," he whispered, with a malicious grin. Panic constricted her throat like a physical hand. She could not form a single word of defense. Every escape route was blocked by his imposing bulk. To run upward meant impaling herself on the sharp spear. To flee downward meant trapping herself in the dead end of the dungeon. Tears of sheer terror welled in her wide eyes. She had accepted the daily risks of her nightly journeys. Facing the immediate reality of a brutal death paralyzed her limbs. The guard reached out to snatch the hidden food from her tray. Far below them, a sudden sound shattered the oppressive silence. It was not a desperate shout or a frantic clash of metal. It was a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the ancient bedrock itself. Arthur had heard every threatening word spoken on the staircase. His unnaturally sharp senses had tracked the heavy footsteps following her down. He had recognized the unmistakable tone of a predator cornering its prey. Rage erupted in his broad chest with a blinding intensity. He had spent 10 agonizing years mastering the beast within his soul. He had allowed the cruel wardens to chain him like a rabid animal. He had endured deliberate starvation and freezing temperatures without a single complaint. But he refused to let anyone harm the gentle woman who brought him light. Arthur stepped away from the frost-covered bars of his cell. He planted his bare feet firmly on the freezing stone floor. Closing his eyes, he stopped fighting the immense power dormant in his royal blood. He let the suppressed alpha aura slip its heavy leash. The temperature in the lower depths plummeted instantly. White frost raced rapidly up the thick iron bars of his cage. The heavy air grew dense enough to choke a grown man. A suffocating pressure surged up the spiral staircase like a physical wave. On the landing above, the guard suddenly stopped moving. His rough hand froze inches away from Julia's trembling tray. The cruel smirk vanished from his face in a single heartbeat. He gasped for air as if drowning in a frozen lake. The invisible weight of an apex predator crushed his lungs. Primal fear overrode all of his rational thoughts. He did not know what monstrous entity was waking in the abyss. He only knew that a terrible death was rising to claim him. The guard dropped his wooden torch onto the stone steps. He abandoned his heavy spear with a loud, clattering noise. Turning wildly, he scrambled up the narrow stairs on his hands and knees. He whimpered like a frightened child with every frantic movement. His desperate footsteps faded rapidly toward the upper levels of the fortress. Julia remained frozen against the wall in the sudden darkness. The discarded torch sputtered weakly on the step below her feet. It cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock her racing heart. She realized the terrifying pressure in the air was not aimed at her. It wrapped around her thin shoulders like an invisible shield. The crushing aura held a strange undercurrent of fierce protection. She knew exactly who had terrified the cruel guard. Her legs shook violently as she resumed her slow descent. She ignored the strong instinct urging her to flee back to the upper floors. Arthur needed to know she had survived the encounter. She reached the bottom landing and stopped before the massive cell. The iron bars were now coated in a thick layer of jagged ice. Arthur stood motionless in the center of the dark chamber. His chest heaved with heavy, rabid breaths. He fought desperately to pull his violent aura back under strict control. He did not want to subject Julia to the punishing weight of his true presence. The oppressive atmosphere slowly receded into the damp stone walls. Julia set her wooden tray down on the familiar spot. She slid the roasted mutton through the narrow gap near the floor. Arthur did not look at the steaming food. He crossed the dark cell in 2 swift strides. Dropping to his knees, he pressed his scarred face close to the icy bars. His dark eyes scanned her pale face with desperate urgency. He searched for any sign of injury or lingering shock. "Did he hurt you?" Arthur demanded in a ragged whisper. His deep voice carried a lethal promise of vengeance. Julia shook her head slowly in the dim light. "You frightened him away," she replied softly. She reached out without thinking and rested her hand near his. Her slender fingers hovered a breath away from his battered knuckles. The natural heat of her skin radiated across the freezing metal barrier. Arthur closed his eyes at the comforting sensation. He leaned slightly closer to her unspoken warmth. "They know you are coming down here now," he warned gravely. He forced himself to pull his hand back into the deep shadows. "You must never walk these steps again, Julia." It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud. He had learned it from the harsh shouts of the kitchen overseers echoing down the ventilation shafts. Hearing her name in his resonant baritone sent a strange shiver down her spine. It sounded like a sacred vow rather than a simple identifier. Julia stubbornly pushed the roasted meat closer to his knees. "I will not leave you to starve," she stated firmly. Her quiet devotion humbled the fierce warlord. He picked up the food with a heavy sigh of defeat. He knew he could not force her to stay away from the danger. He also knew the terrified guard would not keep his humiliating retreat a secret. High above them, chaos was already erupting in the Lord's private chambers. The cowardly guard had burst through the heavy oak doors without knocking. He fell to his knees before the blazing fireplace. He babbled incoherently about a demonic force breaking its chains in the cellar. The lord of the castle was a man ruled by deep paranoia. He listened to the frantic report with a pale, sweating face. He had always feared the inevitable day the Alpha King would regain his strength. Keeping the legendary warrior alive as a hidden trophy had been a foolish vanity. The lord paced nervously across the elaborate rugs of his study. He poured himself a heavy goblet of spiced wine to steady his shaking hands. "The monster is testing his prison," the lord muttered darkly. He imagined the dungeon doors bursting open in the dead of night. He pictured his own fortress burning to ash before the next sunrise. The immense risk of keeping such a dangerous weapon in his basement was no longer acceptable. He turned to his captain of the guard with cold resolve. "Prepare the execution block in the main courtyard," he ordered sharply. The captain hesitated before the roaring fire. He knew the ancient laws regarding holding royal prisoners of war. "When, my lord?" the veteran soldier asked cautiously. The lord drained his golden goblet and threw it into the flames. "At first light," he declared with grim finality. "I want his head on a spike before the sun clears the eastern ridge." The fatal command swept through the stone corridors like a toxic wind. Servants whispered the terrifying news as they stoked the morning fires. Soldiers sharpened their steel swords with nervous energy in the barracks. Julia was scrubbing the breakfast cauldrons when the dark gossip reached the kitchen. The head cook casually mentioned the upcoming execution while measuring flour into a bowl. A heavy iron pot slipped from Julia's soapy hands. It crashed against the stone floor with a deafening clang. The harsh overseer struck her frail shoulder with a wooden spoon. Julia did not feel the stinging blow at all. Her mind had gone entirely blank. A hollow ringing echoed loudly in her ears. Dawn was only a few short hours away. The sky beyond the high kitchen windows was already turning a pale gray. She stared blindly at the white suds bubbling in the murky water. They were going to kill the man who had waited for her in the dark. They were going to slaughter the king who had protected her with his last ounce of strength. A strange calmness suddenly washed over her trembling form. It was the terrifying peace of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She slowly wiped her wet hands on her coarse apron. She knew exactly where the chief warden kept the heavy iron ring of dungeon keys. They hung on a simple wooden peg inside the guardroom near the eastern gate. Stealing them would be an act of undeniable treason. Freeing the Alpha King would spark a bloody war that could burn the continent. She looked down at her own scarred and blistered hands. They were the hands of a worthless servant destined for an early grave. But tonight, they would be the hands that shattered a kingdom's deepest fear. She untied her damp apron and let it fall to the wet floor. Without a backward glance, she slipped out of the bustling kitchen. The fortress was waking up to witness a brutal murder. Julia walked silently through the gray shadows, to steal a miracle instead. She tightened her jaw as she approached the sleeping guardroom. Every breath she took felt like an annealing sharp glass. The heavy iron keys glinted faintly in the dying candlelight. She reached out and closed her fingers around the freezing metal. The die was cast. She only hoped the king in the dark was ready to walk free. The iron keys felt like solid ice against her palm. Julia pressed the heavy ring to her chest to muffle any clinking sounds. She backed slowly out of the dim guardroom. The sleeping sentries snored softly in their wooden chairs. She did not dare to breathe until she reached the empty corridor. Every shadow seemed to reach for her fragile shoulders. The castle remained suspended in the quiet hour before dawn. She moved swiftly past the empty kitchen. The dying embers in the hearth offered no comforting warmth. Her feet carried her toward the forbidden oak door. She pulled it open with a desperate surge of strength. The rusted hinges offered only a quiet groan. She slipped into the black stairwell and closed the door behind her. There was no candle to guide her descent this time. She relied entirely on her memory of the worn stone steps. Panic urged her to run recklessly down the spiral shaft. Caution forced her trembling hands to trace the damp wall. Time was a luxury she no longer possessed. The executioner was likely sharpening his blade in the courtyard. She pushed her aching legs to move faster. The freezing air bit sharply at her exposed throat. She did not care about the bitter cold. Her only thought was the condemned man wading the abyss. Arthur stood motionless in the center of his dark cage. He had sensed the approaching dawn in his bones. He was preparing his mind for a final slaughter. He intended to break his chains when the wardens arrived. He would take a dozen armed men to the grave with him. His royal pride refused to let a coward's axe touch his neck. He gathered his dormant strength into a tight coil. The frost on the iron bars thickened under his rising aura. Then his sharp ears caught a familiar sound. It was the soft scrape of worn shoes on granite. Arthur opened his eyes in sudden confusion. His battle-hardened focus fractured instantly. Julia was not supposed to return to this cursed place. He had explicitly warned her to stay away from the danger. Dread twisted his stomach into a painful knot. If the guards caught her down here again, she would hang beside him. The light footsteps quickened into a desperate run. Julia stumbled onto the bottom landing and fell to her knees. She gasped for air in the suffocating darkness of the cellar. Arthur moved swiftly to the frosted bars. His large hands gripped the frozen metal with crushing force. "Why are you here?" he demanded in a harsh whisper. His voice carried a mixture of profound anger and sharp terror. He wanted to yell at her to run back up the stairs. Julia ignored his fierce tone entirely. She scrambled toward the heavy cell door on bruised knees. She lifted her trembling hands to the pale moonlight. The iron keys dangled from her slender fingers. Arthur stared at the stolen metal in absolute silence. The implications of her action hit him like a physical blow. A lowly maid had just declared war on a powerful lord. She was throwing her life away for a chained prisoner. "They are coming to kill you at sunrise," Julia whispered frantically. She grabbed the massive padlock securing the outer gate. Her small hands struggled to push the rusted key into the slot. Arthur watched her frantic efforts through the bars. "You will die for this," he warned her softly. He did not reach out to help her turn the stiff mechanism. He gave her one last chance to abandon him and survive. Julia simply gritted her teeth and twisted the key with all her might. A loud metallic click echoed through the hollow chamber. The heavy padlock sprang open with a harsh snap. She pulled the metal mechanism free and tossed it onto the stone floor. The thick chains holding the gate unraveled with a loud clatter. Julia grabbed the iron bars and pulled the heavy door open. The rusted hinges screamed in protest against the sudden movement. The physical barrier between them vanished. Julia stepped slowly into the freezing gloom of his cell. She had crossed a threshold for which she could never return. Arthur stood perfectly still in the center of the room. His tall frame cast a long shadow over her small figure. He wore thick manacles around his wrists. Heavy chains anchored his arms to a steel ring in the wall. Julia did not hesitate before his imposing presence. She closed the final distance between them. Reaching out, she gently wrapped her warm hands around his left fist. Arthur stopped breathing at the sudden contact. Her skin felt impossibly soft against his scarred knuckles. It was the first time another human had touched him without violent intent in a decade. A violent tremor racked his broad shoulders. The touch grounded his chaotic mind instantly. "We must go," she pleaded softly. She tried to examine the complicated lock on his wrist bindings. Arthur gently pulled his hand away from her grasp.
He did not need keys to break these particular restraints. He had allowed the wall chains to hold him by choice. He planted his bare feet firmly against the stone floor. His jaw tightened as he summoned his ancient strength. He gripped the steel chain connecting his wrists to the wall. A low growl vibrated deep within his chest. The muscles in his back strained against his torn shirt. With a sudden jerk, he ripped the iron ring straight out of the ancient masonry. A shower of stone dust rained down on the damp floor. The chain snapped with a deafening crack. Julia took a startled step backward. She finally witnessed the true strength hidden beneath his stoic facade. Arthur let the broken chain fall to the ground. The heavy manacles still bound his thick wrists together. He would deal with the remaining iron later. He turned his dark eyes toward the open cell door. The feral aura of the king flared to life in the darkness. He was no longer a victim waiting for the executioner. He was a predator walking out of his cage. Arthur stepped past Julia and moved toward the corridor. He paused and looked back at her over his broad shoulder. "Walk behind me," he instructed in a low tone. It was not a request. It was a command issued by a sovereign. Julia nodded silently and hurried to follow his long strides. They ascended the spiral staircase in complete darkness. Arthur moved with a terrifying grace despite his heavy shackles. His bare feet made no sound on the stone steps. He used his broad body to shield Julia from any potential danger above. They reached the top landing and paused behind the oak door. Arthur closed his eyes and listened intently. He mapped the positions of the castle guards using his sharp hearing. He pushed the wooden door open with a gentle nudge. The kitchen was still empty. They slipped quietly through the shadows of the scullery. Julia guided him toward a hidden postern gate in the eastern wall. She used this narrow exit to discard kitchen waste in the river. A lone sentry stood guard near the heavy wooden door. The soldier was leaning sleepily against his spear. Arthur did not hesitate. He crossed the stone courtyard in 2 silent strides. He brought his manacled fists down hard on the back of the guard's neck. The sentry collapsed onto the cobblestones without a single sound. Arthur caught the falling spear to prevent any noise. He lowered the unconscious man gently to the ground. He refused to shed blood while Julia was watching him. He would not let her view him as a mindless butcher. Julia pulled the iron bolt back from the postern door. She pushed the heavy wood outward. A blast of freezing wind struck their faces instantly. The bitter winter storm raged outside the fortress walls. A thick blanket of snow covered the sleeping landscape. The dark tree line of the black forest loomed in the distance. "Run," Arthur urged her quietly. They stepped through the narrow archway and abandoned the castle. The deep snow swallowed the sound of their frantic footsteps. Julia struggled to push through the knee-high drifts. The biting cold tore through her thin shawl immediately. Arthur noticed her violent shivering. He stepped in front of her to break the harsh wind. He forged a clear path through the heavy snow with his powerful legs. They pushed forward toward the safety of the dark pines. The trees offered the only concealment from the upcoming dawn. A sudden piercing sound shattered the quiet winter night. It was the shrill blast of a brass horn. The alarm echoed off the stone walls of the fortress behind them. The executioners had arrived at the empty dungeon. Shouts of anger and panic drifted across the frozen fields. Torches flared to life along the high battlements. Julia stumbled in the deep snow and fell forward. Arthur caught her instantly with his bound hands. He pulled her upright and held her securely against his chest. He looked back at the fortress with a cold fury. The hunt for the Alpha King had officially begun. The yellow light of the torches pierced the falling snow. Dozens of armed men spilled out of the main castle gates. The distant baying of tracking hounds carried on the wind. Julia felt a surge of despair grip her heart. She had no coat or sturdy boots for this harsh terrain. Her lungs burned with every icy breath she took. She looked up into Arthur's resolute face. He showed no fear of the approaching army. His eyes tracked the moving torches with tactical precision. He knew they could outrun the heavy cavalry in this deep snow. "Do not look back," Arthur commanded softly. He kept his bound arms securely around her shivering shoulders. The tree line was only 50 paces away now. The ancient pines stood like silent sentinels in the storm. They offered a dangerous sanctuary for the fugitives. Arthur practically carried Julia over the final stretch of open ground. They crossed the threshold into the dense forest. The thick canopy overhead immediately blacked the falling snow. The howling wind lost its fierce bite among the massive trunks. Darkness swallowed them completely. Arthur finally released his tight grip on her shoulders. He turned to face the distant fortress one last time. He memorized the banner flying above the highest tower. He would return one day to burn that flag to ashes. For now, his only priority was keeping Julia alive. He grabbed her cold hand with his scarred fingers. The warmth of her skin fueled his determination. He pulled her deeper into the maze of frozen trees. The baying of the hounds grew louder behind them. Dawn was threatening to break the horizon, but their night had just begun. The Black Forest offered a brutal sanctuary from the open snowfields. Ancient pines towered into the dark sky like silent giants watching their desperate flight. Thick branches blocked the worst of the falling snow from reaching the ground. That dense canopy could not stop the freezing wind from tearing through the woods. Julia stumbled blindly over hidden roots buried beneath the white powder. Her thin shoes provided zero protection against the frozen earth. Ice crystals clung stubbornly to the wet hem of her coarse skirt. Every ragged breath she drew felt like inhaling crushed glass.
She forced her trembling legs to keep moving forward despite the agony. Arthur walked slightly ahead to break the harsh wind with his towering frame. He used his broad shoulders as a physical shield against the raging storm. Navigating the dense underbrush proved difficult with bound hands. Yet, he moved through the treacherous terrain with the steady rhythm of a seasoned hunter. He constantly cast quick glances over his shoulder to check her fading pace. Her pale face was practically glowing in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. Exhaustion was rapidly pulling her exhausted body toward the freezing ground. The distant baying of tracking hounds drifted ominously through the ancient trees. That grim sound was growing steadily louder with each passing minute. The local vanguard was moving much faster than Arthur had initially anticipated. Deep snow usually slowed down armored men, heavily weighted by steel. The promise of a massive royal bounty clearly motivated the cruel soldiers. Julia tripped over a buried log and crashed hard into a snowbank. A quiet sob escaped her blue lips as she hit the frozen dirt. She lacked the physical strength to push herself back up onto her feet. Arthur knelt immediately beside her fallen form in the snow. He reached out and gently brushed the white flakes from her freezing cheek. Her pale skin felt terrifyingly cold against his battered knuckles. "I cannot walk anymore," she whispered in a broken voice. Tears of pure frustration welled in her dark eyes. She felt like a heavy burden dragging him straight toward the executioner's block. Arthur did not offer her any empty words of hollow comfort. He slipped his manacled arms beneath her trembling knees and frail back. Standing upright, he lifted her off the ground with effortless grace. Julia gasped in sudden surprise at the unexpected vertical movement. She instinctively wrapped her cold arms around his thick neck for balance. He carried her weight as if she were made of air. "Rest your head," Arthur instructed softly. The savage hounds howled again from a much closer ridge. A cluster of yellow torches flickered brightly through the distant tree trunks. The lead trackers had finally spotted their fresh footprints in the clearing. Arthur stopped walking and turned his body to face the approaching light. He gently set Julia down behind the wide trunk of a massive oak. "Do not move from this spot," he told her with iron certainty. His deep voice held a strange calmness that contradicted the deadly situation. Julia grabbed the torn fabric of his dog shirt with desperate fingers. "They have weapons," she warned him frantically. Arthur offered her a fleeting smile in the encroaching darkness. "They only have steel," he replied simply. He stepped out from behind the tree and walked into the open glade. 5 armed soldiers emerged violently from the tree line. 2 massive dogs strained fiercely against their thick leather leashes. The starving animals snapped their jaws and foamed at the mouth. The patrol captain raised his iron sword with a triumphant shout. He thought he had cornered a helpless fugitive in the deep snow. Arthur stood perfectly still in the dead center of the clearing. He did not raise his bound fists to adopt a defensive posture. Closing his eyes, he merely inhaled the sharp winter air. The agonizing decade of hiding in the shadows was officially over. He opened his eyes and let his true nature break free. The oppressive aura of the Alpha King slammed violently into the clearing. It was a physical weight that defied every law of nature. The howling wind died instantly in the presence of a superior force. The ferocious dogs stopped barking mid-growl. They whimpered in sudden terror and dropped flat onto their bellies. The panic-stricken animals tucked their tails and scrabbled backward into the snow. They recognized an apex predator that mere mortals could not comprehend. The confident captain froze in mid-stride. His triumphant shout died abruptly in his constricted throat. An invisible pressure forced the cruel man straight to his knees. Soldiers behind him dropped their heavy spears in sheer panic. They could not pull air into their lungs under the crushing weight of Arthur's gaze. Arthur did not take a single step toward the terrified patrol.
He merely raised his arms and strained against his heavy manacles. The short chain connecting his wrists pulled tightly across his chest. Flexing his broad shoulders, he twisted his thick wrists rapidly outward. The ancient metal groaned loud at the impossible tension. With a sharp crack, the thick links shattered into jagged pieces. Broken metal fragments fell silently into the deep snow. Arthur rubbed his raw wrists and stared down at the kneeling captain. "Tell your master to keep his dogs inside," Arthur said in a low rumble. His resonant voice carried the lethal authority of a ruling monarch. "If he hunts me again, I will burn his castle down to the bedrock." The paralyzed captain could only nod frantically, while gasping for breath. He scrambled backward into the trees without retrieving his fallen sword. Remaining soldiers fled blindly into the dark woods to escape the nightmare. They cowardly abandoned their expensive dogs in the clearing. Arthur watched them disappear before reining in his violent aura. The oppressive weight vanished from the forest as quickly as it had arrived. Turning around, he walked slowly back to the massive oak. Julia was staring at him with wide eyes. She had felt the terrifying pressure radiate safely around her hiding spot. It was a primal power that belonged only in ancient legends. Arthur knelt in the snow before her shivering form. All traces of the ruthless warlord were completely absent from his face. He looked at her with an intense devotion that warmed the freezing air. "The way is clear," he told her gently. Scooping her back into his strong arms required no permission. They resumed their slow trek deeper into the silent wilderness. The fierce storm raged on above the dense canopy. Arthur relied on his sharp senses to navigate the freezing darkness. He caught the faint scent of old wood ash on the winter wind. Altering their course abruptly, he headed toward a steep rocky incline. A small cabin stood netted safely beneath a stone overhang. The sagging roof groaned heavily under the weight of accumulated snow. Its wooden door hung loosely on a single rusted hinge. It was a meager shelter against the deadly winter night. Arthur carried Julia inside and kicked the door shut against the wind. The dark interior smelled faintly of dry pine and decay. He set her down gently on a dusty bench near the wall. "Stay still," he murmured in the gloom. His large hands worked quickly in the pitch-black space. He found a pile of dry kindling near a cracked hearth. A rusted striker lay forgotten on the stone mantel. Striking a spark against a jagged flint took only a second. A small orange flame eagerly consumed the dry moss. Arthur fed the fire carefully until a steady blaze illuminated the small room. Sudden light revealed the harsh reality of their temporary sanctuary. Thick cobwebs clung desperately to the low ceiling rafters. Wind whistled sharply through a dozen cracks in the wooden walls. But the dancing fire offered the only thing that mattered right now. Heat began to push the bitter cold back into the dark corners. Arthur turned his attention back to Julia. She was shaking uncontrollably on the wooden bench. Her wet clothes clung stubbornly to her freezing skin. Approaching her required slow steps to avoid causing alarm. He did not want to frighten her after displaying his monstrous power. Kneeling before her, he reached for her trembling hands. He rubbed her frozen fingers briskly between his warm palms. The rough calluses on his hands felt strangely comforting to her fragile skin. "You saved my life," Julia whispered softly. She looked down at the broken iron bands still clamped around his thick wrists. Arthur shook his head gently to dismiss the gratitude. "You saved mine first," he corrected her in a hushed tone. Releasing her hands carefully, he stood back up. He grabbed the torn hem of his dark tunic and pulled the heavy garment over his head. Firelight danced beautifully across his heavily scarred torso. Countless silver lines told silent stories of violent battles. He draped the thick fabric carefully over Julia's shivering shoulders. The warm tunic smelled faintly of pine needles and masculine strength. Julia pulled the large garment tightly around herself. You will freeze, she protested weakly. Arthur sat down on the dusty floor beside the hearth. Stretching his long legs out toward the crackling flames provided immediate relief. The cold stopped bothering me a long time ago, he replied quietly. He leaned his broad back against the rough wooden wall. Intense silence wrapped around the tiny cabin like a protective blanket. The adrenaline of their frantic escape was finally beginning to fade. Julia watched the orange firelight flicker across his strong jawline. He looked dangerous and impossibly regal sitting in the dirt. Yet he chose the floor to give her the only elevated seat. Sliding off the wooden bench, she knelt on the floor beside him. Arthur looked over in genuine surprise at her sudden movement. "The bench is warmer," he pointed out logically. Julia shook her head and moved slightly closer to his side. She tentatively rested her head against his bare shoulder. Arthur stiffened instantly at the sudden intimate contact. He held his breath in quiet reverence to preserve the moment. He was terrified of making a wrong move and breaking the fragile trust. Slowly relaxing his tense muscles, he let her lean her weight against him. Lifting his heavy arm, he draped it carefully over her shoulders. His large hand rested protectively against her waist. Julia closed her eyes and let out a long sigh. The terrifying monster of the dungeon was the safest place in her harsh world. They sat together in the glowing warmth of the ruined hearth. The howling wind outside felt 1,000 miles away from their private sanctuary. For the first time in 10 years, Arthur felt a strange sense of profound peace. He did not think about bloody revenge or stolen kingdoms. Thinking only about the steady rhythm of her breathing against his chest occupied his mind. The long night slowly surrendered to the approaching dawn. Pale morning light began to filter through the cracks in the cabin walls. The bright fire had died down to a bed of glowing red embers. Arthur remained wide awake to maintain his protective vigil. Closing his eyes while she slept so trustingly in his arms felt like a betrayal. Suddenly, his sharp ears twitzed at a foreign noise. A new sound broke the crisp morning silence of the forest. It was not the frantic baying of hunting dogs this time. It was the heavy thud of metal-shod hooves striking the frozen earth. Warhorses were approaching their hidden cabin from the eastern ridge. Arthur recognized the distinct jingling of heavy cavalry harnesses immediately. This was not the sloppy patrol of the local lord. This was an elite fighting force moving in perfect military formation. He gently shook Julia awake from her deep slumber. "We have company," he whispered grimly. The wooden door of the cabin groaned suddenly under a heavy knock. The brutal battle for their freedom was far from over. The heavy impact against the wooden doors shattered the morning peace of the forest. Arthur rose smoothly from the dusty floor with lethal fluidity. He positioned his tall frame squarely between Julia and the fragile entrance. His bare back presented a solid wall of scarred muscle against any impending threat. Julia scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the cold stone of the ruined hearth. She clutched his oversized tunic tightly against her chest for comfort. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She fully expected the cruel patrol from the fortress to burst through the splintered wood. A heavy iron gauntlet struck the timber a second time with massive force. The lone, rusted hinge snapped cleanly under the violent pressure. The door crashed inward and hit the dirt floor with a deafening thud. Blinding winter sunlight flooded instantly into the dim sanctuary. Bitter wind rushed past the broken frame to disturb the sleeping ashes. A tall knight stepped slowly through the ruined doorway. He wore thick steel armor polished to a dull silver sheen. A heavy dark blue cloak billowed menacingly around his broad shoulders. He held a drawn broadsword confidently in his right hand.
4 more armed soldiers crowded closely behind him in the deep snow. They formed an impenetrable wall of military might, blocking the only exit. Arthur did not adopt a defensive fighting stance. He simply stood with his bare feet planted firmly on the hard earth. His dark eyes fixed on the lead intruder with chilling calm. The broken iron manacles still hung heavily from his thick wrists. He looked exactly like a dangerous captive ready to slaughter his executioners. The lead knight raised his heavy sword to point at Arthur's chest. His mouth opened to issue a harsh military command. No sound managed to escape his bearded lips. The knight stopped breathing as his eyes adjusted to the interior gloom. His hardened gaze swept over the heavily scarred torso standing before him. He quickly recognized the distinct star-shaped burn on Arthur's left shoulder. It was a legendary mark earned during the brutal siege of the Northern Isles. The soldier slowly raised his eyes to meet Arthur's piercing stare. A profound shock wiped all aggression from the knight's weathered face. His heavy broadsword slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. The expensive steel weapon hit the dirt floor with a dull clang. He ignored his fallen blade and took a staggering step forward. The men behind him gripped their weapons tightly in sudden confusion. They did not understand their commander's strange reaction to a half-naked fugitive. The captain hastily ripped the steel helmet from his head. He tossed the protective gear carelessly into the surrounding snow. Tears rapidly welled in his fierce gray eyes. His lower lip trembled noticeably beneath his thick beard. Dropping heavily to one knee, he bowed his head toward the cold dirt. The harsh scrape of his steel plating against the stone echoed loudly. "My king," the knight whispered with a cracked, breathless voice. Those 2 simple words struck the quiet cabin like a physical blow. A stunned silence radiated outward from the kneeling commander. The soldiers in the snow exchanged bewildered glances with one another. They stared closely at the captive wearing ruined clothes. Then realization slowly dawned on the veteran troops. They finally saw the unmistakable regal posture beneath the grime and shadow. They felt the heavy, suffocating aura radiating naturally from his tall frame. One by one, the elite warriors dropped to their knees in the snowbank. The synchronous clatter of their armor sounded like a falling avalanche. They lowered their heads in absolute submission to their true sovereign. They had spent a grueling decade searching for the ghost of their monarch. Finding him alive in a ruined hunter's cabin defied all their remaining hopes. Julia watched the surreal scene unfold from her hiding spot near the hearth. Her breath caught painfully in her dry throat. She stared blankly at the broad backs of the kneeling knights. These were not local thugs hired by a petty provincial lord. These men bore the insignia of the legendary Black Vanguard. They were the most feared cavalry unit on the entire continent. Their sudden presence here confirmed every terrifying tavern rumor she had ever heard. She had always known the captive in the cellar held immense power. She had heard the kitchen cooks whisper the forbidden title of Alpha King. Knowing the vague legend and witnessing the reality were 2 vastly different things. The traveling bards sang of a monster who burned 3 prosperous cities to ash in a single night. They told dark stories of a warlord who crushed rebellions with a single word. Generations of soldiers were taught to kneel instantly upon hearing his footsteps. The commander in the doorway raised his tear-stained face toward the light. "We thought you perished in the great betrayal, sire," he choked out emotionally. Arthur looked down at his former captain without a trace of warmth. His face transformed into a mask of cold, unyielding stone. He was once again the ruthless sovereign who demanded absolute obedience. "You took too long to find me, Corin," Arthur stated in a flat, dangerous tone. The mild reprimand carried more crushing weight than a shouted curse. The captain bowed his head even lower until his forehead touched the dirt. "Forget us, your grace," Corin pleaded with desperate sincerity. Julia felt the small wooden cabin shrinking rapidly around her. The man standing a few feet away suddenly felt like a distant stranger. The gentle prisoner who had carefully accepted her warm stew was gone. The quiet protector who had carried her safely through the blizzard had vanished. In his place stood a conqueror who held the fate of thousands in his scarred hands. She looked down at her own filthy fingers resting on the borrowed tunic. Her broken fingernails were permanently stained with soot from the scullery pots. Her shoes were nothing more than torn remnants of cheap leather. She was the lowest member of a forgotten and cruel household. The social chasm between them yawned open like a bottomless canyon. A king of this terrifying magnitude did not belong with a kitchen maid. His world was built on blood, steel, and unquestionable authority. Her world was defined by scrubbing iron cauldrons and hiding from overseers. She slowly pulled her trembling knees tight against her chest. An overwhelming urge to fade into the dark corner seized her panicked mind. She firmly believed she did not belong in this gathering of elite warriors. Her silent movement rustled the dry leaves scattered on the floor. That slight sound broke Arthur's intense focus on his kneeling soldiers. He turned his head sharply toward the shadowed hearth. His sharp eyes locked instantly onto her shrinking form. He saw the unmistakable terror blooming in her dark brown eyes. He recognized the sudden emotional distance she was trying to force between them. The cold mask of the warlord shattered in a single, painful heartbeat. Panic flared brightly within his broad chest. He did not care about the loyal army waiting patiently outside the door. He did not care about reclaiming his stolen throne right now. His entire universe narrowed down to the frightened woman sitting in the dirt. Arthur turned his broad back on the kneeling captain. He walked slowly toward Julia with careful, measured steps. He moved as if approaching a skittish deer in a silent forest. The soldiers in the doorway watched their fierce monarch with hidden shock. They had never seen him display such delicate caution toward another living soul. Arthur knelt directly in front of her on the dusty floorboards. He ignored the sharp stones pressing painfully into his bare knees. He did not attempt to touch her shrinking form immediately. He simply placed his large hands palms up on his own thighs. It was a profound gesture of quiet surrender from an apex predator. "Julia," he said softly. His deep voice was stripped of its previous cold authority. It held only a raw, desperate vulnerability. Julia kept her eyes fixed firmly on the broken iron bands circling his wrists. She was truly afraid to look up and see the terrifying Alpha King staring back. "You are a king," she whispered with a highly trembling voice. The factual statement sounded like a tragic farewell in the quiet room. Arthur let out a ragged, heavy breath. He slowly raised a scried right hand toward her pale face. He stopped an inch away from her cheek to give her time to pull away. When she remained still, he gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His rough knuckles brushed lightly against her freezing skin. The familiar warmth of his gentle touch sent a shiver down her spine. "I was a corpse rotting in the dark before you found me," he corrected her quietly. He leaned forward until his face was only a breath away from hers. "My crown means nothing if you look at me with fear." Julia finally raised her chin to meet his intense gaze. She searched his dark eyes for the ruthless monster of the violent legends. She only found the quiet man who had shared her lonely nights in the damp cellar. His eyes begged for her understanding with a silent, fierce intensity. He was pleading for her to anchor him to his newly found humanity. "They are waiting for their ruler," she pointed out nervously. She gestured weakly toward the silent soldiers crowding the small doorway. Arthur did not even glance over his broad shoulder to acknowledge his men. "Let them wait," he replied without a single second of hesitation. He shifted closer until his bare knees touched her worn skirt. Reaching out, he gently took her small, soot-stained hands in his own. He cradled her bruised fingers as if they were made of fragile glass. His large thumbs stroked the harsh blisters covering her palms with deep reverence. "The world outside this cabin will demand blood and war," he warned her honestly. He knew the path to reclaiming his stolen kingdom would be paved with violence. He could not hide his brutal reality from her any longer. "I will have to be the monster they fear, to protect what is mine." He pressed his forehead gently against her in the dim light. The intimate gesture felt like a sacred vow spoken in a temple. Julia closed her eyes and absorbed the steady rhythm of his breathing. "But in here, with you, I am only Arthur," he murmured against her soft skin. He tightened his grip slightly on her cold fingers. "Do not let go of my hand, Julia." It was not an arrogant command issued by a king. It was a desperate plea from a man terrified of losing his only light. Julia felt the massive weight of the kingdom pressing down on their joined hands. She knew stepping out of this cabin meant entering a dangerous storm of politics. She opened her eyes and looked deeply into his fearful gaze. She squeezed his scarred fingers with all the meager strength she possessed. Arthur let out a long, shaky sigh of profound relief. He stood up slowly and pulled her gently to her feet. He did not release her small hand as he turned to face the waiting world. The elite knights remained frozen on their knees in the white snow. They watched in silent awe as their ruthless warlord stepped into the morning light. He was half naked, heavily scarred, and still wearing the broken chains of a captive. Yet he looked more formidable than he ever had in full royal armor. He kept the lowly maid securely tucked against his side. The bright morning sun hit the broken iron manacles on his wrist. The sharp metal gleamed like a dark promise of impending vengeance. Arthur looked out over the snowy ridge toward the fortress they had fled. His dark eyes hardened into chips of black ice. He raised his free hand and gestured sharply to his kneeling captain. "Bring me a horse, Corin," Arthur commanded into the crisp winter air. The desperate hunt was officially over. The bloody time for reckoning had finally begun. Corin led a black destrier through the deep snow. The magnificent warhorse snorted twin plumes of white steam into the freezing air. Arthur stepped forward and took the thick leather reins from his captain. He did not mount the tall beast immediately. Turning back toward the ruined cabin, he offered his scarred hand to Julia. She hesitated near the broken doorway. Her thin shoes were soaked through with icy water. Arthur noticed her silent shiver. He discarded the reins and stepped closer to her fragile form. Without issuing a verbal warning, he gripped her narrow waist. He lifted her from the snowy ground with effortless grace. Julia gasped as her feet lost contact with the earth. He settled her sideways onto the leather saddle. The high pommel offered a secure grip for her trembling hands. Only then did Arthur accept a garment from his waiting captain. Corin handed over a heavy mantle lined with dark wolf fur. Arthur swung the thick wool over his broad shoulders. He fastened the silver clasp at his scarred throat. The broken iron bands still rested heavily on his wrists. He refused an offered breastplate with a sharp shake of his head. He wanted the terrified lord to see the lingering chains of his captivity. Arthur swung himself smoothly up behind Julia. His broad chest provided a solid wall against the biting wind. He reached around her waist to grasp the thick reins. His strong arms formed a protective cage around her small frame. Julia leaned back against his reassuring warmth. The elite cavalry formed a tight column behind their monarch. Steel hooves churned the pristine snow into dark mud. The winter storm finally began to break apart above the ancient canopy. Rays of pale sunlight pierced the heavy gray clouds. They illuminated the distant stone towers of the fortress. Julia felt the rhythmic gait of the horse beneath her body. She kept her eyes fixed on the coarse mane of the destrier. Returning to her former prison sent a cold spike of dread through her stomach. Arthur sensed her rising tension immediately. He tightened his hold around her waist in silent reassurance. "No one will ever harm you there again," he murmured near her ear. His deep voice resonated through his chest and against her spine. The promise carried the immovable weight of a royal decree. The fortress came into sharp focus across the white fields. Panic was already visible along the high stone battlements. Sentries ran frantically between the guard towers. The blare of a warning horn sounded chaotic and weak. It lacked the confident tone of a disciplined military force. The local garrison recognized the dreaded banner of the Black Vanguard. Corin spurred his own mount forward to ride beside Arthur. "Shall we prepare the battering rams, sire?" the captain asked respectfully. Arthur kept his dark eyes locked on the main gate. "That will not be necessary," he replied in a calm tone. The royal procession halted 50 paces from the raised drawbridge. Arthur urged his horse a few steps ahead of the military column. He sat tall in the saddle beneath the morning sun. He made no effort to conceal his face from the archers above. The broken chains on his wrists caught the bright light. An oppressive silence settled over the snow-covered battlefield. The wind ceased howling across the open plains. Arthur unleashed his dominating presence without restraint. The terrifying aura of the Alpha King rolled forward like an invisible wave. It struck the stone walls with a physical impact. Soldiers on the battlements dropped to their knees in sudden agony. Their wooden bows clattered uselessly onto the stone walkways. They gasped for breath under the suffocating pressure of his will. It was a power that demanded absolute submission from lesser men. Arthur did not draw a single weapon from a scabbard. He conquered the fortress using only the fierce weight of his lineage. The heavy iron chains of the drawbridge groaned in loud protest. They lowered the wooden bridge without a single command being shouted from above. The heavy oak gates swung inward to reveal the courtyard. The terrified lord of the castle stumbled out onto the wooden planks. His expensive silk robes dragged through the wet slush. He possessed none of his former arrogant swagger.
The cowardly man collapsed onto his hands and knees. He crawled forward like a beaten dog. Tears of sheer terror streamed down his pale face. He stopped a respectful distance away from Arthur's warhorse. Pressing his forehead against the damp wood, he sobbed aloud. "Mercy, your grace," the lord whimpered pathetically. Arthur looked down at his former captor with cold detachment. 10 years of starvation and darkness demanded a bloody retribution. The beast within his soul roared for a violent execution. But Arthur felt Julia shifting nervously against his chest. He remembered his silent vow to shield her from his brutal nature. He refused to let her witness him acting like a mindless butcher. Arthur pulled his lethal aura back into his chest. The crushing weight lifted slowly from the terrified garrison. "You kept me in a cage for a decade," Arthur stated evenly. His voice carried easily across the silent courtyard. The lord trembled violently against the wooden planks. "The third sublevel is very cold this time of year," Arthur continued. He looked toward Corin with a sharp nod of his head. "Lock him in the deepest cell and throw the keys into the river." Corin saluted sharply by hitting his steel breastplate with a fist. 2 armored knights dismounted and dragged the weeping lord away. It was a poetic justice devoid of spilled blood. The remaining fortress guards surrendered their weapons immediately. They piled their iron swords in the center of the muddy courtyard. Arthur nudged his horse forward into the main keep. The Black Vanguard followed closely behind their sovereign. They secured the perimeter with efficient military precision. Servants huddled fearfully in the stone doorways. They expected the invading army to pillage their meager belongings. Instead, the disciplined knights ignored the common workers entirely. Julia spotted the cruel head cook hiding behind a wooden barrel. The harsh woman was weeping in abject terror. She did not even recognize the filthy girl sitting upon the royal horse. Arthur halted his mount near the grand stone staircase of the main hall. He slid smoothly from the saddle and landed on the cobblestones. Reaching up, he grasped Julia by her narrow waist. He lifted her down with the same effortless grace as before. Her feet touched the muddy ground with a soft splash. She stood awkwardly near the massive flank of the warhorse. The busy courtyard felt overwhelming after the quiet isolation of the cellar. High-ranking commanders of the vanguard began to gather near the stairs. Several wealthy nobles from the surrounding provinces had traveled with the army. They wore plush velvets and heavy gold chains of office. These ambitious men sought to prove their loyalty to the returning king. They formed a respectful semicircle at the base of the steps. They waited eagerly for Arthur to address his newly reclaimed court. They expected him to ascend the stairs and claim the high seat. Julia shrank back against the leather saddle of the horse. She felt painfully out of place among the glittering armor and fine silk. Her coarse apron was still damp from the kitchen water. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her pale face. She belonged in the shadows of the scullery. She did not belong in the center of a royal court. A graying noble cast a disdainful glance in her direction. His cold eyes judged her filthy state with open disgust. He assumed she was merely a spoil of war or a discarded servant. Julia lowered her chin and stared intently at the mud. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. Arthur stood halfway up the stone staircase. He looked down at the assembled lords and military commanders. The crowd held its collective breath in eager anticipation. They waited for a speech of conquest and glorious return. Arthur did not utter a single word to his waiting court. His dark eyes scanned the courtyard and found Julia hiding by the horse. He saw the slight tremble in her thin shoulders. He noticed the arrogant sneer on the face of the graying noble. A dangerous fire ignited instantly in Arthur's chest. He turned his back on the waiting assembly without hesitation. He walked slowly down the stone steps toward the muddy courtyard. The heavy silence in the keep grew profound and tense. Nobles and knights parted hastily to clear a path for his long strides. Arthur ignored their bowed heads and respectful murmurs. He walked with a singular, unyielding purpose. He stopped directly in front of Julia. She looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Arthur reached up and unfastened the silver clasp at his throat. He pulled the royal mantle from his own broad shoulders. The dark wolf fur looked incredibly warm and luxurious. He stepped into her personal space and draped the massive cloak over her.
The thick wool swallowed her small frame almost entirely. Arthur carefully adjusted the heavy fabric around her delicate neck. He fastened the silver clasp beneath her chin with gentle fingers. His rough knuckles brushed against her cold skin in a tender caress. The action was startlingly intimate in front of the massive army. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered nobility. It was an unprecedented breach of royal protocol and strict hierarchy. A king did not surrender his mantle to a lowly scullery maid. The royal cloak was a symbol of absolute authority and divine right. Placing it on her shoulders elevated her above every lord in the courtyard. Arthur did not care about their silent outrage. He kept his focus entirely on Julia's bewildered face. "You are shaking," he murmured softly. His voice was meant only for her ears. Yet the quiet courtyard caught the intimate sound. Julia gripped the edges of the soft fur with trembling hands. "They are watching us," she whispered nervously. Arthur finally turned his head to look at the gathered crowd. His piercing gaze swept over the shocked faces of the council members. The dangerous alpha aura flared slightly as a stern warning. The elder nobles quickly averted their eyes and bowed their heads lower. No one dared to voice a single objection to his scandalous behavior. "Let them watch," Arthur declared in a resonant tone. He reached out and took her small hand in his scarred grip. He intertwined their fingers for every ambitious lord to witness. He was claiming her in the light just as she had claimed him in the dark. Arthur led her toward the grand stone staircase. He forced the high-born nobles to step aside for a kitchen maid. Julia walked beside him beneath the weight of the royal mantle. She felt the hostile stares of the council burning into her back. Arthur squeezed her hand gently to anchor her racing heart. The fortress was officially his once again. But the silent war for Julia's right to stand beside him had only just begun. The ancient corridors of power awaited their newest, unwelcome guest. The transition from a damp cellar to the royal chambers felt like a strange dream. Julia stood near the grand window of her newly assigned quarters. She wore a gown woven from soft wool rather than coarse linen. The fine fabric felt unnerving nor light against her bruised skin. Servants who once barked cruel orders now averted their eyes in her presence. They scurried away whenever she walked down the stone corridors. Arthur had trapped his own royal mantle over her shoulders just 2 days ago. That singular gesture had shielded her from immediate physical harm. It had also painted a bright target on her fragile back. The fortress was rapidly filling with arriving nobles and high-born dignitaries. They came to swear fealty to the resurrected monarch. Arthur spent his waking hours confined in the war room with his military commanders. He was meticulous dismantling the corrupt network left by the former lord. His unavoidable absence left Julia navigating the treacherous political waters alone. She felt like a small sparrow trapped in a cage of starving falcons. The hostility directed at her was never spoken aloud in the hallways. It manifested in cold stares and sudden silences when she entered a room. The ancient hierarchy of the realm was rigid and unforgiving. A woman who had scrubbed cauldrons possessed no place beside a sovereign. A formal summons arrived shortly after the midday bells tolled. A stoic guard delivered a parchment sealed with the crest of the Elder Council. The message respectfully requested her presence in the western wing. Julia knew Arthur was currently inspecting the outer cavalry camps. She had no one to ask for guidance regarding this unexpected invitation. Refusing the highest governing body of the kingdom felt like a dangerous insult. She gathered her courage and walked toward the designated meeting hall. The western wing remained untouched by the recent military occupation. It smelled faintly of old parchment and expensive incense. The heavy doors of the council chamber stood slightly ajar. Julia pushed them open and stepped into the circular room. 7 elderly men sat around a massive table carved from dark oak. They wore robes of deep crimson to signify their elevated status. These were the patricians who had managed the realm during Arthur's long captivity. They were shrewd men who valued order above human life. Lord Stirling sat at the head of the polished table. His silver hair was combed back with meticulous precision. He did not offer Julia a chair when she approached the center of the room. "You have served the crown well," Stirling began in a smooth tone. His voice carried the deceptive warmth of a hidden blade. "The king owes you a great debt for your actions in the dark." Julia kept her hands folded tightly in front of her waist.
"I did not ask for a reward," she replied softly. A patronizing smile touched the edges of Stirling's thin lips. "That is fortunate," the elder statesman murmured. He leaned forward and steepled his wrinkled fingers together. "Because the reward you currently hold threatens the stability of our entire nation.
The remaining council members watched her with unblinking scrutiny. They resembled a pack of wolves circling a wounded deer. "His Grace is a man of fierce loyalties," another elder interjected smoothly. "He clings to you out of a misplaced sense of wartime gratitude." Julia felt a cold knot tighten in her empty stomach. She remembered the desperate vulnerability in Arthur's eyes within the ruined cabin. It was not mere gratitude that bound his soul to hers. "You are confusing honor with affection," a third man stated harshly. Sterling raised a hand to silence his impatient colleagues. "The ancient laws dictate the purity of the royal bloodline," Sterling explained. He gestured toward a thick leather tome resting on the table. "A monarch must wed a woman of noble birth to secure the noble houses." He fixed Julia with a stare devoid of any empathy. "Your continued presence here makes him look weak to our enemies." The accusation struck her harder than any physical blow ever had. She had risked the executioner to save Arthur from his icy prison. She never intended to become the anchor dragging his reign into ruin. "I only want him to be safe," Julia whispered honestly. Sterling nodded as if she had just confessed to a crime. "Then you must understand why you cannot stay within these walls." He pushed a heavy leather pouch across the polished wood. The unmistakable clinking of gold coins echoed in the quiet room. "This fortune will secure a comfortable life for you in the southern provinces," he offered. It was a blatant bribe disguised as a generous pension. "A carriage is waiting near the eastern gate to ensure your discreet departure." The council had planned this ambush with calculated precision. They intended to banish her before Arthur returned from the military camp. Julia stared at the pouch of gold with growing horror. Accepting the money meant confirming their belief that she was just a greedy opportunist. Refusing the money meant challenging the most powerful men in the kingdom. "The king told me not to let go of his hand," she stated firmly. She raised her chin to meet Sterling's imposing gaze. Her voice trembled slightly, but her posture remained straight. "I will not leave unless he commands it." The polite facade vanished entirely from Sterling's aged face. He stood up from his carved chair with sudden menace. "You do not possess the luxury of refusal," the elder hissed. He slammed his fist against the ancient law book. "We can have you thrown into the river for trespassing in the royal wing." The overt threat hung heavily in the tense atmosphere. These men wielded enough administrative power to erase her existence. They could easily forge documents claiming she had fled in the night. Arthur would return to find her gone and assume she had abandoned him. Tears of profound frustration burned the corners of her eyes. She took a slow step backward toward the heavy wooden doors. She needed to escape this suffocating chamber and find Corin. Before she could turn around, the heavy doors blasted open with a deafening crash. The thick oak slammed violently against the stone walls. The hinges screamed in protest under the immense force. A freezing gust of wind swept into the warm council room. The candles illuminating the table flickered wildly before dying completely. Arthur stood framed in the ruined doorway. He wore his dark riding leathers and a scowl of pure murder. Corin stood a few paces behind him with a pale, anxious face. The captain had clearly informed his sovereign about the secret summons. Arthur did not wait for the stunned elders to offer a respectful greeting. He stepped into the chamber and unleashed his raw power.
The oppressive aura of the Alpha King flooded the room instantly. The temperature plummeted until frost formed on the glass windows. The invisible pressure forced the standing elders back into their chairs. They gasped for breath as the air grew dangerously thin. Sterling clutched his chest in sudden agony. Arthur ignored the suffocating politicians and walked directly to Julia. He stopped in front of her and examined her pale face. He saw the unshed tears shining in her fearful eyes. A low growl vibrated deep within his broad chest. He turned his formidable attention toward the terrified council. Arthur stepped past Julia and approached a massive oak table. He did not raise his voice to shout at the trembling men. His terrifying calm was far worse than any fiery outburst. He reached down and drew his broadsword from its leather scabbard.
The sharp ring of steel sliding against metal cut through the silence. It was the sound of an executioner preparing for the final strike. The elders shrank back against the carved wood in absolute terror. Arthur did not swing the heavy blade toward their fragile necks. He drove the iron tip of the sword directly down into the center of the table. The ancient wood splintered loudly under the violent impact. He buried the blade deep enough to anchor it firmly in the oak. The weapon quivered slightly from the sheer force of his thrust. It stood there like a lethal monument dividing the room. "You speak of ancient laws," Arthur stated, in a voice like grinding stones. He leaned slightly over the hilt of the embedded sword. "I am the law." Sterling struggled to pull air into his constricted lungs. "Your Grace," the elder wheezed desperately, "we only sought to protect the dignity of the crown." Arthur narrowed his dark eyes at the pathetic excuse. "You sought to intimidate the only person who remembered I was alive," he countered coldly. He reached out and pushed the pouch of gold off the table. The heavy bag hit the floor and spilled coins across the stone. "Your gold cannot purchase what she freely gave me in the dark." Arthur straightened his tall frame and surveyed the cowering council. His lethal aura continued to press down on their weakening bodies. He was establishing a boundary that no political maneuver could ever cross. "She does not kneel to your counsel," Arthur declared with absolute finality. He pointed a scarred finger at the trembling politicians. "If any of you speak to her without my permission again, you will lose your tongues." The threat was not a metaphor. The ruthless warlord was fully prepared to dismantle his own government. He would gladly rule over ashes before he let them drive her away. Arthur turned his back on the paralyzed elders. He walked back to where Julia stood frozen near the doorway. The terrifying aura radiating from him vanished the moment he reached her side. He offered her a gentle expression that defied his previous violence. Reaching out, he carefully took her trembling hand in his own. His rough thumb stroked her knuckles in a soothing rhythm. He did not care that he was touching a servant in front of the highest lords. He was actively dismantling their archaic rules with his bare hands. "Are you unharmed?" he asked her softly. Julia nodded silently and squeezed his scarred fingers. She felt the residual heat of his anger fading into a protective warmth. Arthur did not look back at the ruined table or the embedded sword. He led Julia out of the suffocating council. The heavy silence of the western wing followed them into the corridor. He kept her hands securely locked within his strong grip. The political storm had been violently suppressed for today. Yet Arthur knew the ambitious nobles would simply change their tactics. They would never accept a scullery maid walking the royal halls. He needed to prove her worth in a way they could not ignore. He stopped near a grand balcony overlooking the snowy courtyard. The winter sun cast long shadows across the stone battlements. "They will not stop trying to remove you," Arthur warned her honestly. He released her hand to gently cup her pale cheek. "I must give you a shield they cannot break." Julia leaned into his warm touch with a questioning gaze. The dangerous resolve in his dark eyes hinted at a drastic decision. He was preparing to rewrite the very foundation of his kingdom for her. The fortress awoke to the deafening toll of the iron bells. Every lord and military commander received an urgent summons to the central throne room. Arthur did not intend to negotiate with the remaining members of the Elder Council. He planned to sever their political maneuvering with a single strike. Julia sat before a silver mirror in the royal chambers. 4 silent handmaidens worked meticulously to prepare her for the morning assembly. They dressed her in a sweeping gown of midnight blue. Silver thread wove intricate patterns along the heavy hem. The luxurious fabric felt grounding against her bruised skin. She stared at her own reflection with lingering disbelief. The soot and exhaustion of the celery were washed away, yet the quiet resilience in her dark eyes remained unchanged. Arthur entered the dressing room without knocking. The handmaidens bowed their heads and retreated into the stone corridor. He wore a formal tunic of black velvet embroidered with the royal crest. A silver sword rested securely at his narrow hip. The jagged scars on his neck were visible above the stiff collar. He carried his brutal history openly rather than hiding it behind silk. Approaching her chair, he placed his large hands gently on her shoulders. His warm touch sent a familiar shiver down her spine. "You look like the dawn," Arthur murmured to her reflection. Julia reached up and covered his scarred fingers with her own. "My hands still remember the ash of the kitchen hearth," she whispered softly. She feared the gathered nobility would only see the lowly servant beneath the silk. Arthur leaned down and pressed a lingering kiss against her temple. "They will see the woman who kept their sovereign breathing," he promised. He stepped back and offered her his open palm. Julia took a deep breath to steady her racing heart. She placed her hand into his secure grip. They walked together through the wide corridors toward the great hall. 2 massive doors loomed at the end of the final passageway. Corin stood waiting beside the entrance in his polished armor. The veteran captain offered Julia a deep bow of genuine respect. He signaled the guards to heave the heavy doors open. A sea of tense faces turned immediately toward the arched entrance. Hundreds of wealthy nobles crowded the cavernous hall. Banners of conquered provinces hung from the vaulted ceiling. The murmuring crowd fell silent the moment Arthur crossed the threshold. His oppressive aura preceded him like a physical shockwave. It commanded absolute obedience from every soul in the vast room. Julia kept her chin raised, despite the terrifying weight of their collective gaze. She focused her attention on the steady rhythm of Arthur's footsteps. He led her straight down the center aisle woven with crimson rugs. Lords and ladies parted hastily to grant them an unobstructed path. Lord Stirling stood near the base of the elevated dais. A dark bruise marred the pale skin of the elder's jawline. It was a subtle reminder of the violent warning issued yesterday. Arthur did not spare the scheming politician a single glance. He guided Julia up the marble steps of the dais. An ancient throne forged from black iron dominated the platform. Arthur did not take his rightful seat upon the massive chair. He stood beside it and turned to face the silent assembly. Julia remained standing close to his right side. The physical proximity was a deliberate challenge to the old laws. 10 years ago, this court abandoned me to the dark, Arthur began. His resonant voice echoed clearly off the stone walls. The blunt accusation caused several older lords to flinch visibly. You allowed a traitor to lock your rightful king in a frozen cage. He swept his dark eyes over the ocean of velvet and silk. You measured loyalty in gold and whispered schemes in warm rooms. Arthur released Julia's hand and took a slow step forward. I survived the abyss because one person defied your cowardly rules. He reached into the deep pocket of his black tunic. Withdrawing a delicate object, he held it up to the morning light. It was a slender circlet forged from white gold. Tiny diamonds caught the sunlight and fractured it into brilliant sparks. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered nobility. The circlet was the legendary crown of the consort. It had remained locked in a royal vault for over a century. "The ancient laws demand I wed a woman of noble blood," Arthur stated loudly. He looked down at Lord Stirling with a gaze of pure ice. "I declare that true nobility is forged in sacrifice, not born in a comfortable bed." He turned back to face Julia. The fierce warlord softened instantly under her wide eyes. Arthur raised the gleaming circlet with both hands. Julia stood perfectly still as he lowered the gold onto her dark hair. The cold and settled firmly against her brow. It was the unbreakable shield he had promised her. "She is your queen," Arthur decreed, with earth-shattering finality. The title hung in the silent air like a ringing hammer strike. "Her word carries the exact same lethal weight as my own." He placed a hand on the hilt of his silver sword. "Anyone who questions her place beside me will answer to my glade." The terrifying promise required no further explanation. Arthur had conquered cities with less effort than he spent defending her. Corin was the first to react in the tense silence. The loyal captain dropped to one knee on the marble floor. He drew his longsword and laid it flat against the stone. "Long live the Queen!" Corin shouted with fierce devotion. The mighty soldiers of the Black Vanguard followed their commander immediately. Hundreds of armored knees struck the ground in perfect unison. The thunderous sound reverberated through the ancient hall. The terrified nobles realized their precarious situation. Hesitation in this moment meant a swift accusation of treason. Lord Stirling lowered his proud head and sank to his knees. The remaining lords and ladies followed the elder in rapid succession. A cascading wave of submission swept across the vast room. Within moments, the entire court of the realm was kneeling before Julia. She looked out over the sea of bowed heads. These were the same people who had driven her to near starvation.
They had threatened to throw her into the freezing river yesterday. Now they pressed their foreheads toward the floor in abject surrender. Julia turned her gaze away from the conquered nobility. She looked up at the man standing tall beside her. Arthur was watching her with a quiet, undeniable reverence. He had bent the rigid world to his will just to carve out a safe space for her. She reached out and rested her hand against his broad chest. The steady thud of his heartbeat grounded her racing thoughts. He covered her hand with his scarred fingers and squeezed gently. The kingdom belonged to them now. Weeks slowly turned into a peaceful winter month. The chaotic transition of power settled into a stable rhythm. The fortress shed its grim atmosphere of paranoia and fear. Servants received fair wages and safe working conditions. The cruel cook was dismissed from the royal kitchens. Julia navigated her new role with a gentle grace. She refused to govern through the crushing terror Arthur often utilized. Instead, she offered mercy where the harsh laws demanded blood. Her quiet compassion won the genuine loyalty of the common people. Even the bitter council members learned to respect her sharp intuition. The kingdom prospered under the balanced rule of the fierce king and his gentle queen. Yet their public majesty masked a profound private devotion. The deep winter chills still gripped the land outside the stone walls. A fierce blizzard battered the high windows of the royal bedchamber. Inside, the grand room felt like a secluded sanctuary. A massive fire roared within the black hearth. The dancing flames cast a warm orange glow across the woven rugs. Julia sat in a plush armchair near the crackling fire. She wore a simple linen nightgown devoid of royal embroidery. The heavy gold circlet rested forgotten on a distant wooden table. She did not need a crown to feel secure in this private space. Arthur sat on the fur rug near her bare feet. He wore loose trousers and a simple cotton shirt. The formidable warlord looked at peace in the quiet room. He leaned back and rested his head gently upon her knees. The position mirrored their silent vigils in the dark cellar. Only the freezing iron balls were missing from the equation. Julia ran her slender fingers slowly through his dark hair. She traced the familiar curve of his ear with a tender touch. Arthur closed his eyes and let out a long, contented sigh. The tension of ruling a fractured kingdom bled out of his broad shoulders. He turned his face slightly to press a soft kiss against her palm. His rough lips lingered against her skin for a quiet moment. "The snow is falling heavy tonight," Julia murmured into the silence. She listened to the wind howling against the thick glass panes. Arthur kept his eyes closed as he absorbed the comforting heat of the fire. "It cannot reach us in here," he replied with absolute certainty. He reached up and wrapped his large hand around her delicate wrist. He did not pull her hand away from his hair. He merely wanted to feel her steady pulse against his scarred fingers. 10 years of solitary agony felt like a distant nightmare now. The crushing isolation had been permanently shattered by a stolen bowl of stew. He remembered the sound of her worn shoes on the granite steps. He remembered the terrifying courage it took for her to cross his threshold. The entire continent still feared the wrath of the legendary Alpha King. Foreign armies trembled at the mere mention of his violent history. His counselors still hesitated before speaking in his intimidating presence. But the man resting his head on her lap harbored no violent intentions. He was just a survivor who had found his way out of the dark. Julia continued to stroke his hair with a rhythmic, soothing motion. She looked down at the relaxed features of his rugged face. The harsh lines of worry and war were smoothed away. He breathed in a deep, even cadence that signaled profound trust. Morning light began to slowly breach the stormy horizon outside. Pale rays filtered through the frost-covered glass of the high windows. The gentle illumination stretched across the dark rugs. It climbed slowly up Arthur's resting form. He did not stir as the dawn light brushed against his closed eyelids. The monster locked in the cellar had finally found his permanent dawn. He no longer needed to wait in the dark for a fleeting moment of mercy. The morning had come to stay.
Sometimes, true love starts with a single act of kindness in the darkest places. If Arthur and Julia's story touched your heart today, please hit that subscribe button for more romances. I'm always curious how far these stories travel. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from right now. And let me know, what was your favorite moment in their journey? Share your thoughts below, and I'll see you in the next story.